God's will for your life. And you have been led by the Spirit of God to a particular spot. Did you know that the steps of righteous people are ordered of the Lord? And I sat there and began to pray, and that couple began to bawl and weep, and there is no doubt. I couldn't pray for him to come back, but I could ask the presence of God to come into in and out. And we walked out, my wife and I, having such a feeling of knowing that God had led that moment. You talk about burdened and heartbroken for the couple, but having this sense that Almighty God just used us right there. I got on a plane about a month ago to go to Florida to some situation, and one of the flights I sat down beside this 15-year-old girl. And here I am, an old man, sitting down, and she probably looked at me, oh no, that's not what I wanted sit beside me, you know. But she looked bummed out. And so I said, hey, it's 15, and I'm a school administrator. Well, how come you're not in school? This is not Saturday. And she says, well, my parents divorced. Dad went to California, Mom to Florida, and I now have to go to Florida, and I don't like it. And she was really bummed. And I happen to believe that God put me in that seat, and I asked her the question, what do you need the Lord to do for you? And I was shocked. She says, I want direction from the Lord. I want to know how to hear the voice of God. 15 years old, my brother. And I began to pray with her in there in that seat, and then when I got done, I said, I've got to tell you that I ask this question a lot, and I have never had such a request come from such a young person. And she says, well, really? Tell me about some of the other responses of people. And we began to talk about God and the will of God, and the woman sitting beside was listening, people up here were listening, and I'm smack dab in the will of God for my life, ministering to this young girl. Her name was Jeannie, and I said, you'll never see me again, but I want you to know I will be praying for you. There was you talk about, you can celebrate when you do something significant, something that will last for eternity. I have a notion that one of these days when I walk down the streets of gold, bounding up the streets will be Jeannie, and she'll be leaping and giving me a hug, for she knew that something unusual happened that day. The will of God is exciting and celebrative. Lastly, the will of God is compelling, it's costly, it's celebrative, and lastly, the will of God is conclusive. Conclusive. There is a conclusion, folks. There is an ending time of doing the will of God for you on the earth. The sun is setting. The night is coming when no man can work. The will of God is conclusive. There is an ending time for each ministry, each calling, each person. Is what you're doing compelling? Is it costly? Is it celebrative? And does it bring you joy? And do you know that you only have a short while to do it? I'm going to conclude with one last missionary story. But before I do that, I want to read another poem from another missionary. And Devaney, would you want to come back and sing that song again? And as you look at the words, you'll probably understand why I wanted it to grip your heart. But Charles Greenaway, great missionary, he was the field director for none other than India. He wrote this: if I should quit, what would the gain be? Would the battle be lost? Would I really be free? No, the door would not close, nor the battle cease, because God would have another to stand in the breach if I should quit. If I should quit, what would I do? Seek shelter from the heat? Forget the cry of the lost? Would I be happy for a time and then find I was through and spend my time praying for something to do, saying, God, why did I quit? If I should quit, I would find that God had not. The battle would still rage, the church would march on, the wind would keep blowing, the Spirit infilling, only I would be further and further behind, unwilling and wondering, God, why did I quit? If I should quit, what could I say to God who called me, and the people who sent me, and the pagan who trusted me to show him the way? And the Spirit's urging day after day, God, I can't quit. If I should quit, let it be when I'm dead, not while I'm alive, nor when I'm dissatisfied, nor when I'm criticized or minimized or ostracized. But please, God, let quitting time for me be when I am dead. These arrows, I like to deer hunt and like to bow hunt. I know I probably went down south. I went south with some of you, but when you're poor and in Virginia and you got to have something to eat, you hunt. And but I read a story in this book right here, Lords of the Earth, and it's about a group of people in New Guinea, which is just above some islands above Australia. And back in these days, the Galleys considered them the lords of the earth. They thought they were the lords of the earth. And it was one of the toughest missionary assignments, because these people met very few white people, and they ate them when they did come. They were cannibals. And so when you went there, you had to know that you were compelled to go, and that it just might be costly. And there was a guy named Stanley Dale who was just an uncouth kind of a guy, loved God, had great ethics and morals, and loved the Lord, loved people, but he was no diplomacy. He'd speak the truth when he shouldn't. And he alienated so many people, so many missions organizations, that he'd been kicked out and kicked out and kicked out just because of his gruff nature. Finally, this one missions board, when they interviewed him, thought he would be ideal for New Guinea. I mean, a guy that nobody can stand, getting amongst those cannibals, he would be the ticket. So Stanley Dale went to New Guinea, and he began to minister to the Yalis. And sure enough, they wanted to eat him. And there was a bunch of them that surrounded him one day, inspired by the witch doctor. And Stanley had the notion that wherever the Lord leads you, He'll provide and He'll protect. And so they are all surrounded him, and if he's going to heaven now, that'll be okay too. Well, he took out his false teeth while these men with bows and arrows are going to shoot him, and he just started clack, 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 clack. And they thought he was a god to be able to take his teeth out like that and clack them and then put them back in. They took off. And for a number of years, he had the ability to minister to these Yalis because they thought he possibly was a god. Well, he looked up into the mountain ranges, and he saw mountain peaks, and he knew there were other people groups, the other Yalis that he needed. So he took some of the Yali Christians, and by now the missions board said he needed help, and so they found a man, a guy named Phil Masters, who could get along with anybody. He was so easily entreated. Stanley Dale could be as gruff and rough as he wanted, but Phil would just roll with it. So these two were ideal matches, and so they decided to go up and try to reach some other people groups, and the notion was, even though when they showed up, their religion told them to eat all of these strangers that came their way, because if they didn't, those strangers would have put a curse on them and all their practices, and their way of life would be done. They had to eat them. And Stanley and Phil, with the 3 or 4 Yalis, took up out into the mountains. They started hitting these new villages, and right away they got to one village, and the Yalis knew the signals. They grew their own tobacco, and the leader of the particular village would greet them, stay here, but they had ideas going on in their head. And he went up and touched Stanley Dale in the chest and lit his homemade cigarette, but he did something